Hey, welcome everybody to our weekend service and all of our campuses that are joining us. You that are there in commercial, hey, a big shout out to you. Our Strathcona campus, welcome. So good to be with you. And then, of course, Pitt Meadows, always a delight to be there with you as well. And you might be listening by podcast, or maybe you're watching online. It's somewhere else in the world, but we're just so glad that you are a part of our service, and we trust that God has something specific for you today. We've been in a series about our 4 big things, and the first one we talked about is follow. The second one was connect. The third one was discover, and today we're going to talk about serve. And it's a pretty huge topic when we talk about serving, and hopefully today's message will push us out of our boundaries just a little bit, and we'll be inspired by some other people who have just gone beyond what we would think they should go in the area of service. And many stories that I can't wait to share with you. Mark 9, verse 35 is a key verse, and if we have that, we can put that on the screen. But Mark 9, verse 35, Jesus is meeting with his disciples. And this is where he's got them together, and he sat down and he said, "Whoever wants to be first must take last place and to be the servant of everyone else." It's an upside-down kingdom. We've talked about that before, but God's kingdom is upside down. The world's way says, I need to push ahead and get into first place if I want to make a name for myself. Well, God's kingdom is the exact opposite. If you want to be great, one translation says, then be a servant of all. If you want to be great, and most of us want to be great at something. Most of us want to know what our purpose is, and we want that purpose to be fulfilled in our lives because it gives us really great satisfaction knowing that we were able to be used to help somebody else along their way. But Jesus' way is the opposite way. If we want to be great, be a servant of all. We're going to look at 5 benefits of serving today, and I trust that every one of these points will be inspirational for you. The first one, the benefits of serving, is it builds strong relationships. John chapter 13, verse 12 to 17 says this. Then he said, and again, Jesus is talking, and it's an example of when he was with the disciples. He knows that it's within the next 24 hours, his life on earth is going to radically change. And this is what our master is doing. Then he said, "Do you understand what I've done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. That is what I am. So, if the master and the teacher washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do. I'm only pointing out the obvious. A servant is not ranked above his master. An employee doesn't give orders to the employer. If you understand what I'm telling you, act like it and live a blessed life." Jesus set a platform, a pattern for you and I. Does that mean now when we go into somebody's house to really show that we're serving them, that we ask them to take off their shoes and want to wash their feet? You have to understand, in the culture and in the day, it took great humility to do that. That was really the job of, if you had the staff, a servant would do that when you would walk into someone's house. What we do in Canada is we take off our shoes when we go into someone else's house. And sometimes it could be offensive. In other cultures, if you walked into their home and as soon as you got in, you took off their shoes. We learned that the hard way. We lived a couple of years in the U.S., and when we were down south, a couple had invited us over, and when we came into the entrance of their home, we immediately started taking our shoes off. They didn't say anything, but we saw this look on their face like, what in the world do you well, you sure make yourself at home, which later on, as we got to know them, they thought it was, became a joke that we had made ourselves at home so quickly when we walked in the door. And here we thought we were just being polite Canadians and taking our shoes off. So this isn't suggesting now that all of us need to go and wash each other's feet. It's a pattern. It's something that's laid out for us. It's a map of how we're to treat others, that we never think more highly of ourselves than we ought. And that's what Jesus was saying. He said, if I'm your master, and if I'm the one that is the Lord of all, and I'm okay serving you by washing your feet, by helping you feel more comfortable, I'm okay doing that. In fact, that's my very nature. And if that's his nature, that should be our nature. So it builds strong relationships when somebody serves you. You remember when somebody serves you. You remember when somebody goes out of their way to be a support to you, and it was something that they didn't have to do. When my husband's father passed away over 10 years ago, there was a member of our congregation here, downtown Vancouver, drove the trip out to Pincher Creek, Alberta in one day, left early in the morning, was there for the funeral that afternoon, and as soon as the funeral was over, he didn't stay for the reception because he had to drive back here for work the next day. Do you know what we still remember that. It was such an act of service for him to take a day off to drive the distance that he did just to be there as a support from someone from Coastal at that particular time. You don't forget how that builds relationships in your lives. And what does it do in turn? You feel like that I would do anything for that person. We would go out of our way to support that person. And he certainly didn't do it for that reason. But it does. It builds relationships. That's one thing that happens when we serve. Gary Chapman has a book called The 5 Love Languages. If you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. Or even go online and do the Wikipedia version of it. And you can see that there are 5 areas that all of us, categorizing, of course, all of us, but there's 5 areas of giftings that is considered our love language, and some have stronger love languages than others, and one of those is the act of service. Now, you know if the act of service is your love language, because it makes all the difference if somebody does something for you. If you don't have that act of service, I'll tell you right now, this message, you have to make a lot more of a choice to say, I will move in the place of service, because it's not something that is even a natural bent in your life. My husband has a high gift of acts of service. One little example of that would be, and I think I've shared it before, when we used to live in a house with a garage, I was pulling into the garage one afternoon after grocery shopping, and came in and was bringing the groceries, and he helped me, brought the groceries into the kitchen, and I was putting them away, and he was standing there, and I was like, are you okay? He goes, how'd you like it? I was like, okay, how did I like what? And he goes, did you notice? And I said, did I notice what? He said, and he had this hurt look on his face, and he said, I just spent I don't know how many hours cleaning up the garage, thinking that when you would drive back in, you would look at this and go, this is so beautiful. Look how clean this garage is. And quite honestly, I hadn't even noticed that he cleaned the garage. That was a huge withdrawal, so I had to make up for that one. But for him, that when I give him an act of service, when I do something for him, it just speaks love, love, love. Well, Jesus is all 5 love languages, and that's been imparted into all of us. And so even if it isn't our natural bent to step into that place, by the love of God in us and by his Spirit living in us, we do become servants of all. The second thing it does is it builds unity. And I believe there's Philippians chapter 2, verse 2 is on the screen. Then make me happy, it says. Then make me truly happy by agreeing wholeheartedly with each other, loving one another, working together with one mind and purpose. Don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others as well. Then there's another verse, I think it's just so great. John chapter 15, verse 15. In the Amplified version, it says this, I do not call you servants any longer. This is what Jesus is saying. I'm not calling you servants anymore. For a servant does not know what his master is doing, but I call you my friends because I've revealed to you everything that I've heard from my Father. You know, to be a servant, just to be a servant, means I have to do to get. And Jesus is trying to push us out of that boundary, think outside that box, because his kingdom goes so far beyond that. It's not about doing so I can get. It's about that being our very nature. We have the nature of a giver on the inside. And when he said, now I call you friends, we become friends out of loyalty and love. And that's really what we should be doing when we serve one another. It's out of loyalty and love, a heart of that. Third one is builds a bridge to the gospel. When we serve, there is this bridge that's built. And there's an excellent story in the book of Acts about Paul when he found himself on the island of Malta. And in Acts chapter 28, verse 3, just a small portion of that story, it says this: as Paul gathered an armful of sticks, stop. As Paul gathered an armful of sticks. Now, you might say, well, of course he had to gather an armful of sticks because he was actually on the boat as a prisoner. But when you read prior to this story, you see the favor that was on his life. And you saw how someone earlier in that story that was on the boat, because the boat, they actually had to swim to shore. And you have to read Acts chapter 28. It's fascinating. But as they're swimming to shore, these different prisoners that were being trekked across this waterway, he is finding himself on this island. They're building a fire. He's collecting the wood, not because he's a prisoner, but because he's a servant. And at that time, when they see this scorpion come out of the fire and bite him, and a poisonous creature, and he just shakes that thing off, then the native people from that island are saying, oh, that's why he's a prisoner. He must be a murderer. And now the gods are getting back at him. And they saw that didn't do anything to Paul. And you continue on in that story and how Paul is used to minister. God uses him to bring healing to one of the lead people that are on that island. And because of that healing, many more come to know the gospel, and he has an opportunity to share it. It's a fascinating story how one person who was serving, just gathering wood, and this scorpion happened to come out, and how that literally changed the course of why they had to stop on this island. When we serve God, there is an open door to share the gospel. It builds this bridge. Because service is an upside-down kingdom. Serving is not what we normally do. In our self-serve world, it's all about us. We need to get ahead. We want our food through a drive-through. We want to pick up our own things. It's we want to do it ourselves. So when we go out of our way to go the other way and serve others, the world around us looks at that and says, what's going on? Why are you like that? It's a very cool story. There's a story about a man who worked for a ministry called Operation Mobilization. Maybe you've heard of it, and it happened quite a few years ago, actually 1967 to be exact. And he was living in India at the time, working for this ministry, and he developed tuberculosis. And as a result, he was admitted into a sanitarium. And so he brought tracts with him, stories about who Jesus was, and he wanted to hand them out to everyone that he came to while he was in the hospital. And he found that nobody would take them. Patients wouldn't take them, doctors wouldn't take them, nurses wouldn't. Nobody would take these tracts or these stories about Jesus. And he said he could also tell that they just weren't happy that he was even in the hospital, because to them, he was the rich American, whether he said whether I had anything or not, which he said I didn't, but just the fact that he was American was a strike against him. So he was quite discouraged while he was in there. He was discouraged while he was being sick. He was discouraged while everyone was angry at him. He was discouraged because he wasn't able to share the gospel, and that's why he was in India in the first place, and no one would talk to him. So the first few nights, he would wake up around 2 a.m., and he would have this coughing fit. And one morning, as he was having that coughing spell, he noticed an older and sicker patient who was across the aisle trying to get out of his bed. And he said he'd see him sitting on the edge of his bed, and he was trying to stand, but because he was so weak, he would just fall back into the bed. And he couldn't really understand, this gentleman, missionary, couldn't really understand what he was trying to do because he didn't understand the language. But the man began to cry softly that had fallen back in the bed. And the next morning, they all realized what he had been trying to do. He simply wanted to get up and go to the bathroom, but because he was so sick and so weak, he wasn't able to do it. And so As a result, there was a stench in the ward, and most of the patients yelled out insults because of the smell. The nurses were agitated, and they were angry because they had to clean up the mess, and they were rough with him as they changed his bedding, and actually one nurse even went as far as slapping him. The man was incredibly embarrassed and just curled up in a ball and wept. The next night, again around 2 o'clock, this missionary woke up coughing and noticed the man across the aisle sitting up again and trying to do exactly the same thing that he had seen him do the night before. However, he was so weak, once again, he fell back in his bed and was whimpering. He thought to himself, he said, I really don't want to get involved in this, because he was sick himself and he was weak himself, but he realized, and before he even realized it, he got out of his bed and he went over to the older man who was still crying. And he reached down and he touched his shoulders, and with his eyes opened with a fearful, questioning look, the missionary looked and smiled at him. He put his one arm under his head and neck, and he put the other one under his legs, and he picked him up. And even though he was weak and sick, he was stronger than the man he was carrying. He walked down the hall to the washroom, and he said the washroom itself was smelly and filthy. It was just a hole in the ground. And he stood behind this man with his arms under his arms, holding it up so he could take care of himself. And when he finished, he picked him back up again and carried him on his bed. When he laid him down, the old man kissed him on the cheek and said something which he assumed was thank you. He said, but I was amazed what happened the next morning. One of the patients that he didn't know woke him up at 4 o'clock with a steaming cup of delicious Indian tea. Then he made motions with his hands, indicating that he wanted one of those tracts. And when the sun came up, some other patients came, and they also motioned that they wanted the tracts. And throughout the day, people began coming to him asking for those gospel tracts. It included the nurses, the hospital interns, the doctors, until, listen to this, everyone in that hospital had received a tract. Over the next few days, several indicated that they trusted Christ as their Savior just by reading that gospel tract. So what did it take? What did it take to be the bridge for the gospel? One man acting out of service. One man doing something that was difficult for him to do, but stepped out of himself and helped someone else. So again, that third point is it builds a bridge for the gospel. The fourth one is it builds significance. Serving builds significance. Look at Proverbs chapter 13, verse 15. It says, good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard. A man of understanding finds favor. And we all want favor, but in order to find the favor, we need to have the understanding of what the need is. And once we understand what the need is, then we're empowered to fulfill that need. And that's the exciting thing about being a believer, is we have the ability to say, my sheep, Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice. That we can hear the voice of our Father speaking to us and showing us a need, just like this missionary that was in India. Dave Thomas was the founder of Wendy's hamburger chain, and he's known for his humble service in this multi-billion-dollar industry. How many of you have not had a Wendy's burger or something from Wendy's? I mean, we all know what Wendy's is. But he actually said everyone that works at Wendy's needs an MBA. And when the first time that he said that, the audience that was chuckled because they knew that he didn't have that type of education. And he said, oh, well, I know it's not the kind of MBA you think it should be, but my NBA is mop and bucket approach. Everybody needs to be able to get out a mop and bucket and be able to do the smallest thing, because if we want to be great, we have to be a servant of all. Isn't that cool? Yeah. He too would jump in and they would see him doing the same thing. Another story that is just so good to share with you, and it's about D.L. Moody. And D.L. Moody, if you don't know who he is, please do some research and find out about this great evangelist. And it was the late 1800s, and there was a large group of European pastors that were meeting up in Massachusetts. And according to their custom, what they would do when they would stay at a hotel, at a nice hotel, is they would take off their shoes, put them outside the door, And a shoe shine, someone that would work at the hotel would pick up the shoes. They would be shined during the night, and then early in the morning, those shoes would be brought back to the door, and they would be shone beautiful. Pretty nice hotel, or maybe they should reinstate that. That would be really nice. So he was later in the event that evening at the hotel, and so when he was walking down the hallway, he noticed some of the hotel rooms of his European friends, and they had their shoes outside the door. He knew that the hotel in America that they were staying at would not do that and had no intention of touching their shoes. But what he decided to do is take all of those shoes himself to his room and buff them and polish them. And the only way and he wasn't going to tell anybody. In fact, the only reason this story even came out is one of the men that was on his team had seen him, was on his support team, had seen him take those shoes, and he knocked on the door and he asked if he could help. And he said, "I just don't want you to tell anybody this is what we did." And he said they all came the next day, and their shoes were shone. And but this friend did tell a few people, and during the rest of the conference, they had a group of volunteers that after these guys went into their room and put their shoes outside the door, and D.L. Moody's little, whatever they were, people, I was going to say like elves, but they're not elves. They were actual people. They weren't elves. Bad analogy. They were actually people, just like us, that actually went and took somebody else's possible smelly shoes and cleaned them up and left them back outside the door again. Reminds me, too, of Joseph in the Bible, because Joseph is another person who must have had a servant heart and served with such compassion and love, because his father could trust him when he even sent him to his brothers. He was a servant. He was a servant for Potiphar. He was a servant to the jailer. He was a servant to Pharaoh. He knew how to serve. And it reminds me of going back to the very first verse we talked about. If you want to be great, be a servant of all. And that's exactly what Joseph was. We look at his greatness. We look at how he forgave, there's so many facets to the Joseph story. But one of them is definitely the fact that he was a servant. And that is part of who we are as well. The fifth one is build spiritual maturity. Serving builds us up. In John chapter 12, verse 25 and 26, again, Jesus is talking, and he says this: "Those who love their life in this world will lose it, and those who care nothing for their life in this world will keep it for eternity. Anyone who wants to serve me must follow me, because my servants must be where I am, and the Father will honor anyone who serves me." I think we're all on the same page, and we could all say this together today. I want to be honored by the Father. Jesus says here that the Father will honor anyone who serves me. And just as much as we know to honor children or to obey their parents, or honor your father and your mother, that there's a command to do that. And then with that command, when we obey, there's a commanded blessing. Whatever God commands us to do, it's never to put us on a leash and put out a whip if we don't obey. That's not what his commands are for. His commands are there because he wants to provide blessing. When we honor our parents, there is a commanded blessing. When we walk in unity, there is a commanded blessing. When we serve Jesus, there is a blessing from the Father. When you serve in his house, when you serve in your home, husbands, when you serve your wives, wives, when you serve your husbands, children, when you serve your parents, employees, when you serve your employers, church family, when you serve in your church. There is a commanded blessing when we step into a place of service. It reminds me of a woman, still attends our church. Her name's Alandra. And a number of years ago, actually before the Shangri-La went up, she was one of the top sellers for the units at the Shangri-La. And so their office, their storefront office, or what's it called when you have their showroom, thank you, their showroom was right across the street, actually where J.J. Bean is. And so she worked there, and on her way to work, she would stop here at the church, And she would get the dusting supplies. And you see those little holes in every single one of the pews? For those that can't see, I know you can't see that because Pitt Meadows, you're in a theater and you have these cushy seats that you get to sit on. Well, we're downtown and we have hard pews. But we like them. We actually like our hard pews. We're not complaining, commercial, that you have cushioned pews and we have hard pews. It's okay. We like our hard pews. But there are these little holes in the side of every one of the pews, and she would get the dusting supplies, and she would sit down and she would dust all of those little holes. It takes a long time. She would come in every week and she would dust, and she said, I want to serve in God's house. My time right now, my schedule is sporadic. I can't serve the way I would like to serve, but this is something I can do, and I can pray while I'm in here. And she would do that week after week after week, dressed up, ready to go across the street and do what her occupation was. During that time, she also just said, I really feel like I need to step out in faith and do something else. And so she also joined our greeting team. And while she was on our greeting team, if you're on one of the teams, you know that the schedule comes out a couple months in advance, and where your slot is, where you're volunteering, and really where that position is as an H&L team member. And she was scheduled on this one particular Sunday morning, and she actually didn't tell me, someone else told me that worked with her, told me and said, you know that her and her husband were invited to a beautiful home in Whistler that same weekend as their guests, to be guests with some friends of theirs. And she said to her husband, if it would have been any other weekend, I could say yes, but I cannot go. I promised I would serve on the greeting team during the 11 a.m. service that Sunday. And her husband said what most of us would say, well, can't you get somebody else? Can't you just change with somebody else? She goes, no. I told the Lord I would do it on that day. I committed to Him. I didn't commit to a person. I committed to the Lord, and I am fulfilling what I said to Him I would do. Wow. That is a wow. She's an incredible example of a servant, and even to this day continues to serve. Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 says this, work willingly at whatever you do as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. And that's exactly what the example of Alandra is. Another example I want to share is by a man by the name of Rockefeller, and I'm sure that name is familiar to everyone here. He was the first person in the U.S. to reach the status of a billionaire. And at the age of 23, he was a millionaire. At the age of 50, he was a billionaire. Every decision, all of his relationships, was all tailored to create personal power for him. But 3 years later, at the age of 53, he became severely ill, and his entire body was racked with pain. He lost all the hair on his head, and in complete agony, the world's only billionaire who could buy anything he wanted could only digest milk and crackers. An associate wrote, he couldn't sleep, he wouldn't smile, and nothing in life meant anything to him. That year passed agonizingly slow. But one day, as he approached death, he had vague remembrances of a dream, and he could barely recall the dream, but he knew that it had something to do with life after. He realized that he wasn't in control of his own life. He called his attorneys, his accountants, his managers, and he said that he wanted to channel all of his assets into helping others through hospitals and research and mission work. And actually, as that happened, that was the introduction to some breakthroughs in penicillin cures for malaria, tuberculosis, and diphtheria because of the money that was spent for that. The list of discoveries is enormous, but I think the biggest thing of all is that something happened to him physically when he began to give away. His body began to heal and get stronger, and he actually lived to the age of 98. And he said that year and what that dream, how it changed his life, it put him into a place of gratitude and serving. When we go into a place of service, we get out of ourselves. When we look down, all we can see is ourselves, but when we look up, we see what God sees. And when we see what God sees, we see needs. And if we see a need, he will give us the ability to help fill that need. I'm not talking about changing. Let's go out and just change the world. Jesus has already done that. What I'm saying is that whatever he puts before us, whoever we see in front of us, say, God, what do you want me to do in this situation? Where are you compelling me right now in the area of possessions, in the area of where I have power, in the area of those different areas in your life? What's in your hand? What can you do? And one last story before I turn it over to our campus pastors. There's so many stories, but this one is really good. You're going to really like this one. I think you like that, but this one is really good. It's a story about a Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, and he illustrates a story about a prince that's in search for his queen. And one day this prince was running an errand in a local village for his father, and he passed through a poor section of the city, and guess what? You can well imagine. Guess who he saw? He saw the most beautiful woman he's ever seen before, and he wanted that woman to be his wife. And so he found reasons to go back to that particular part of the city over and over and over again. And he realized that there would be no way that she would even notice him because she would just put her head down when he would come near. So how was he going to win her hand in marriage? He couldn't just order her to be his wife because that wouldn't be love. He was seeking a soulmate. So he really wanted her to love him. So he came up with another solution. He took off his kingly robe and he put on the garb of a peasant, and he moved into that village and he began to live among the people. And he shared the interests of the people, their concerns. He learned their language and talked like they did. It wasn't a disguise anymore. It was a new identity. And over time, he was able to see the young girl, and you know the rest of the story. Eventually, she did become his wife. Well, that's really what Jesus did. God wanted to be in relationship with you and I. And in order to be in that relationship, he came down to our level, so to speak, and he became like us. And when Jesus was born in that manger and grew up as divinity that was housed in humanity, he did it because of his great love for us. He wanted to relate to us. I'm going to ask our campus pastors to come on up, and they're going to finish closing the service for you right now. Jesus really is our supreme example of a servant, right? And if we, again, going back to that verse, if you want to be great, be a servant of all. And the fact that Jesus would come to earth and in obedience to his Father, great love, not only at the beginning of his life, but also at the end of his life. You have to remember that when he was in the garden, he actually was struggling with going through with what he knew he had to do. If there's any other way, let this cup be taken from me. He was struggling with what he would have to do on our behalf. But he was able to say in those moments, nevertheless, not I that live, but Christ that lives, or Christ lives in me, that's what we say. But he said, nevertheless, let this, not my will, but your will be done. He believed that God had a bigger plan. And church, God's got a bigger plan for you and I. And that place of a bigger plan has to do with serving one another. It has to do with us moving into a place of service, into even a greater degree than what we've already known. And in that place is huge blessing. There's all these benefits that I just mentioned. Why do you have what you have? I think some of us will leave today and say, oh, think about that. That was interesting. There was a few points there that stirred my heart. But there's others of us here tonight that are ready to go a step further. And I'm going to invite you, as you are here, to all bow your heads and close your eyes. And the first thing I want to do is ask, if you haven't made Jesus Christ the Lord of your life, to give you an opportunity to do that. He so wants to come into your world, like I said, but not just stand beside you. He wants to be the Lord of your life and live in you. It's something to say, I'll just do things for God. It's another thing to have him in us. Christ in us, the hope of glory. And you have that opportunity tonight. And we're going to pray in just a moment. The other thing, or group of people that I believe are here tonight, are those that want to act now and say, Jesus, I'm ready to make a change. I don't know what that means for me. I don't know what you're going to ask me to do. It's kind of scary, actually, because I don't know what's going to happen. But I'm ready to take that step of faith because I'm feeling a little agitated where I am. Do you know that God takes us to this place of agitation for a reason? Because when we're in that place, we're ready for a change. Agitation isn't always a bad thing. It pushes us to do something we wouldn't normally do. And so I'd love to pray for those as well that just feel like, I'm ready. Let's do it. Jesus, let me serve you in a greater manner. So let's pray this first prayer all together. I'm going to invite those again, if you haven't prayed this prayer, to ask Jesus into your heart. Let's do it together. Say, Heavenly Father, today's my day. I hear you knocking on my heart's door. Jesus, will you come into my life? Be my Lord, my Savior. I give you my life.